given the fact that we have not yet heard from Iran confirming much of what the president has indicated in terms of how close a deal is and what all the deal is going to entail, would you join what is clearly some degree of euphoria we are seeing in financial markets today in terms of your confidence that this really may be on track to being over?
Thanks for having me. I think that this might be some short-term euphoria because we've already seen the IEA essentially say that it would take about 2 years to get back to normal, especially for LNG markets, because we've seen about 80, oil and gas facilities damaged in the region, and there's a backlog essentially. So we'll see what happens with the markets once this euphoria dies down and once we see what's actually going to happen with these negotiations, because we've seen a lot of mixed messaging on whether the negotiations are even going to continue. We saw Iran say that it's going to open the Strait of Hormuz, and yet we also saw Trump say that he's going to continue the blockade on Iranian ports and vessels. So it's really unclear what's going to happen. We should know more and get better clarity within the next few days. But then I've said that before, and it's actually gotten even more confusing as time has gone on. But right now we're in a very fragile ceasefire, I would say. So good to see that markets are rebounding, but we'll see if that is actually maintained.
If there were a breakthrough, if there were a peace deal, Natasha, some might argue that the hard work begins with the idea of political saboteurs in Iran and throughout the region. Bring us inside that conversation. Who would you be most concerned with when it comes to maintaining a peace following this conflict?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question because I think too often with the media, with headlines, we concentrate on the ceasefire, on the agreement being signed. But on the ground, political and military dynamics shift as those agreements are signed. And we've seen that in Gaza, and we've seen that in Lebanon, and certainly we'll see it here as well. There are a lot of details to be worked out, as your reporter mentioned, when it comes to enrichment, which again, we've been talking about for a long time. And if the Iranian regime is saying things like it's going to freeze its nuclear program or its efforts towards a weapon, that doesn't actually differentiate its points in the past. So a lot of very complex technical questions when it comes to enrichment, enriched material, and there's a lot of spoilers here, and there's a lot of ways that Iran could continue to make money through these negotiations, either through released assets, though the administration has denied that, or by applying tolls to vessels as it goes out. I mean, the fact remains that Iran now knows that it has this leverage, not just over the United States, but really the global economy. So there's that, and we haven't really seen the Houthis come into play. We're still waiting to see what happens in Lebanon in the fragile first hours of this ceasefire, but a lot can go wrong.
Well, it's an important word of caution, Natasha. And as we consider the notion specifically around the Strait of Hormuz, the idea that Iran is now declaring it open today, even if there may be some caveats to that, does that not mean that at any point in the future, Iran, if it so chooses, could also decide once again to declare it closed? I just wonder if we should really be treating this as if it's some kind of return to normal, if we're ever going to be able to go back to what the pre-normal was in that regard.
I think this is the biggest geopolitical loss of this entire war. Essentially, we saw that Trump said that Iran will never, ever close the Strait of Hormuz again. But the entire reason that Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, something it's never done in the past, was because the U.S. and Israel went to war with Iran. So now it knows that it has that leverage. And that's a real loss, I think a real geopolitical loss for the United States, for the Gulf countries, and for the rest of the world, that this now probably more extreme regime knows that it can do this.
More extreme regime. The president says exactly the opposite. Less extreme, more reasonable. Who will we be sitting across the table from if this, in fact, does resolve into another meeting this weekend? The president says it won't be J.D. Vance on our side. Who will be on Iran's side if we get back together in Islamabad?
Well, if the last talks are any kind of measure, we know that Arakshi
Yeah.
is a very skilled negotiator. He knows the details of the
Hmm.
nuclear program and many of these issues, so he will likely play a part. And we've seen other figures that have been involved in Iranian politics for some time. But the more we see of these figures, we see that they're much closer to the IRGC and more extreme elements of the Iranian regime. We're not really necessarily seeing reformists. But again, these are sophisticated, skilled negotiators. They know the ins and outs of the nuclear program, obviously, of the past negotiations with the US administrations. And so I think what we need to be focused on is who's going to be on the US side negotiating, because it's unclear to me that those that have been involved have that level of detail to be able to really hammer out some kind of real agreement that doesn't see a return to war or a freeze on the global economy.
Well, Natasha, on this idea of hammering out detail, we have seen kind of a repeated pattern with this administration. Historically, I'm talking about in the context of trade deals, where an agreement is announced in principle, that there's some kind of understanding, and we don't actually see everything finalized and codified, if you will, in terms of a formal treaty. That a lot of those details just never fully worked themselves out. And I wonder if you think that we could see something similar taking place this time around, that the president could declare, there's an agreement in principle, we have a deal, but nothing is signed, approved by Congress for some kind of a period of time, and what kind of volatility we might expect in that interim period.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And that was my point about the details being worked out, because the Iranians probably know how to sort of manipulate those details so that President Trump has some kind of win so that he can save face, but saving face superficially, in fact. And so, I get a little bit concerned about the original problem, which was Iran's nuclear weapons program, because I do see a lot of ways for the U.S. to want to walk away from this in order to lower gasoline prices here at home, amongst many other things, for the midterm elections. So there's a lot of political reasons for him to walk away from this, or to have some kind of superficial agreement that doesn't actually solve any problems.
The president has said that he's reopening the strait not because we need it, but he's doing it as a gift to the world. Enter the UK and France, and this was before these headlines broke, had planned to host a summit to set up their own naval force, a new sort of coalition of the willing that they're calling the Maritime Freedom of Navigation Initiative. Keir Starmer says the summit will include about 40 nations. Natasha, will that still be needed if the strait is reopened, so to speak, reopened during this period in a peace deal with the United States? Or is every nation or every region going to be on their own with their own defensive force like this?
I think so. I mean, I think that even if this summit doesn't take place, this is going to, alter many countries', various contingency plans. And we saw this coming, with, I think, the increasing irrelevance of the UN and its ability to solve problems, that you would have increasing numbers of so-called coalitions of the willing, some of which would not include the United States, in order to get things done. And we've seen this with Canada's leadership talking about, moving away from the United States, having its own, economic and political and military deals with other countries. I also don't think that bodes well for the United States as a superpower in the future as well, because you'll increasingly see that the United States isn't solving problems, it's creating problems that others need to solve amongst each other. And so, with this closure of the Strait of Hormuz, most certainly we're going to be talking about alternatives to the Strait of Hormuz more significantly, in terms of pipelines, in terms of other countries creating coalitions in order to secure their own resources. So I don't think this is a sign a deal and done and we're back to normal. I think many countries are working on what their contingency plans are for the future.